All right, well, let's get going. Welcome everyone to Hegel 1313, and a special welcome to Professor and Dean of the Humanities, Bruno Bosteels. So it's a special treat to have Bruno with us today. In large part, the Hegel 1313 series is a product and part of our conversations early on, last summer, when the ideas were starting to ruminate. And Bruno was an extraordinary interlocutor with just a number of incredible ideas about how to think about Hegel and the reception of Hegel and the inversions of Hegel. And and Bruno has also been following the series with us and been active participant throughout the year. And so we're really deeply grateful for all of that, Bruno. And in speaking about what Bruno would talk about, we decided that it made most sense to focus on really Alain Badiou's reading and his engagement both with Hegel and with Mao. So this is going to be kind of a Hegel, Mao, Badiou conversation. Before I formally introduce Bruno, who you all know, but who I will introduce formally, I just wanted to say one word about today's session and about this fascinating constellation, which we'll be hearing a lot about. Just because for me, there are certain times when you hit an image that says everything. And here, as I was preparing for this seminar, there was just one image, which I'm going to flash on for you in a moment, that says everything about why we're here doing Hegel 1313. And so it was as I was reading the early writings, and so this is a kind of an early intervention during what is referred to as Badiou's red years, a period that extends from slightly before May 68, so somewhere in 1966 to somewhere around 1967. Actually, here's another copy of the book I'm holding, but it doesn't have the cover, so it's a lot better. Théorie de la Contradiction, which comes out in 1975, and it's in this series, and maybe you'll give us some background on the series. It's a series that he was putting together, militant publications, part of what was called the Yinan collection. Yinan, of course, being the mythic headquarters and a home base of the Chinese Communist Party, and of Mao, where Mao's home was, etc. And so part of his very Maoist intervention, intellectual and practical, was to create this series of books. One of them, the first one is Théorie de la Contradiction. The second one was De l'idéologie with François Balmès. And there were a series, some of them, others that we're going to talk about today, which is the translation of the rational kernel of the Hegelian dialectic. And in this volume, it's kind of it's a militant work, a militant volume, a militant engagement. It's about how intellectuals, in fact, are behind the curve of the avant-garde Maoist workers. And what he's trying to do in these works is to bring intellectuals up to speed in a way. We'll talk about this, but there's this point where at some point he says, okay, here's what we're going to be publishing, okay? Here's what we're going to be publishing. And so he draws a list of the publications, of the 5 premiers fascicules, so the first 5 tracts or pamphlets that are that we foresee are the following. So Alain Badiou, Théorie de la Contradiction, that's the first one. It's actually in here that there's this little list. Alain Badiou, Francis Balmès, Révolte, Idéologie, Théorie, that becomes de l'idéologie, which is published the following year. Then there's also planned to be something on materialism and idealism between Badiou and Ballanger. And then 4, Hegel, right? It's not like It's not, we don't know who the author is going to be of this, right? We don't know what the intervention is going to be, what piece of it, it's just, but it's Hegel, right? In the middle of this, the most militant production of kind of collection press, somehow at the heart of it, we have to have something on Hegel, right? And no, it's not Marx, it's not Lenin, it's not Mao even, it's Hegel. And in a way, I don't know, this image here, right? Kind of like what you do with Hegel and how what you do with Hegel affects your praxis and your theory is really what Hegel 1313 is all about. So maybe this shall be the new banner for Hegel 1313. Anyway, I want to start there because I was just so struck by that as I was going through these materials. Now, of course, so what does Badiou do to Hegel? I think that's what we'll be trying to focus on tonight, to Hegel and to Mao. Let me just quickly then introduce our extraordinary speaker, Bruno Bosteels, of course, as you know, here at home, Dean of Humanities, and the Jesse and George Siegel Professor in the Humanities in the Department of Latin American and Iberian Cultures. So he is a literary critic, critical theorist. He has been with us at the previous 1313s, presenting last year on Marx also. And his research covers wide topics: literature, culture, politics in modern Latin America, as well as contemporary political philosophy and political theory. He's the author of multiple books, as well as the important translations of Alain Badiou's work. So most of the translations that we're going to be working with tonight have been translated by Bruno Bosteels. He's also the author of books on Alain Badiou, for instance, Alain Badiou, Une trajectoire polémique, which was with La Fabrique, Badiou and Politics, and of course a number of other works on questions of the commune and in Latin America, communism, the actuality of communism, Marx and Freud in Latin America. So it's with great pleasure that I turn it over to Bruno Bosteels with deep thanks for joining us and anticipation for an extraordinary presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Bernard. I might counter it, that image with a quote that I'll edit a little bit to make it more applicable for today. This is from an epigraph from Mao in the little booklet on the rational kernel of the Hegelian Dialectic, which came out in the same series, the Enunciator, which is the book that was announced as just Hegel. In this epigraph, it says, I take this sort of as a motto for a lot of the work that I'm doing now. The shortcoming of some of our intellectuals is precisely that they know too little about the negative stuff. Having read a few books by Marx, they just repeat what is in them and sound rather monotonous. Their speeches and articles are not convincing. If you don't study the negative stuff, you won't be able to refute it. So that's in part a larger context in which I would like to situate these comments today. Before getting into the Badiou, though, I would like to do a fairly long detour to talk about my own unease and discomfort with speaking about Hegel in the 1313 series that are typically organized around major figures, mostly European philosophers. And we are doing this in the United States, in North America. So I wanted to start with a first long reflection on what it means to think about Hegel in America. Because I think the place of enunciation, like the place from which one speaks, in my case that means, well, we are here in the United States, but my own work is also in Latin America. And we had many conversations, Bernard and I, over the summer, about Hegel and bibliographical references, some of which are in the bibliography that appears on the website, of sort of non-European readings of Hegel. But here we are, again, about a European reading on a European philosopher, which sort of always means like where are the peripheries, right? Where are the colonies and ex-colonies? And for me, I want to turn this into a question of method, around this tricky question of Hegel in and on America. That was also the title a few years back of a conference among Latin American Hegelians. So I want us to reflect on what makes it possible for all of us in this room or on the Zoom or the YouTube video to have a common language that we understand in English with translations from Chinese that I am assuming very few, if any, in the room have been able to read directly in Chinese. The Zhang Xiyin text on, he's a translator of the complete works of Hegel, kept on working on Hegel even after many of these texts that Badiou and his friends were translating and commenting. But we do this in a language that is easily transmittable, that seems to flow through a conceptual language that we share, that is shared from South Korea to Tierra del Fuego. What makes that possible when the objects that we are discussing actually, even though they sometimes do talk about those other regions, those debates are never ever mentioned, right? So there was sort of a selective focus. Last year when we did the 1313 on Marx, I presented about the civil war in France and the Paris Commune, and again tried to deviate our attention away from the Paris Commune to draw attention to a much longer and much wider tradition of transatlantic communes or comunas or comunero revolts in the New World. Again, here's the problem. If we continuously draw attention to the fact that you should also be talking about these peripheral regions, it sounds always as though we want to particularize or provincialize the European philosophers, like provincializing Europe as kind of a strategy. That seems to be a reactive approach. And you're always on the loser's end, because the Central European philosophers who shared this unspoken universal language of theory and philosophy do not have to mark their place of enunciation, because it goes without speaking, literally. It goes without speaking. If you want to write a book on theory of ideology, and you're only talking about Argentina or Mexico, a publisher in the US will probably say, maybe you should mark this in the title so as not to deceive your reader, that you're not talking about a theory of ideology in general. If you're doing this about Germany or France, no problem, right? This has to do with not just with the cultural hegemonies and the marketability of ideas. It has to do, for me, with something about the method. And this is precisely, has everything to do with the method of Hegel thinking, if we take it to be containing a materialist kernel that could be rescued, or that needs to be, not extracted, but sort of forced open or cracked open. So let me put this in the context of, so I would like first to address this sort of question: what are we doing by discussing Hegel in America or in the Americas? And what does that say about method between history and philosophy? And I want to put like three epigraphs. One is from a book that I will briefly discuss of a good friend and Hegelian philosopher, decolonial thinker, Rosia Zambrana, in her book Hegel's Theory of Intelligibility, and says to be is to be intelligible, according to Hegel. Catherine Malabou, whom many of you will know, The Future of Hegel, Plasticity, Temporality, Dialectic, and she writes, necessity forgets its own origin. And then Hegel himself, in the Lectures on the Philosophy of World History, for America, the only principle left over would be that of incompleteness or constant non-fulfillment. The first quote to be is to be intelligible, according to Hegel, draws attention to the fact that all Hegel's concepts are drawn from historical determinations, that they are concepts of the real, or forms that give shape or that give a figure to real activities and practices. This is something that Zhang Xiying, in the text that Badiou and his comrades are translating and commenting in The Rational Kernel of the Hegelian Dialectic, also points out when he explains that between these two series of the logical and the historical, we need to understand how they coincide. How logic is always the logic of history. How the concept is a concept of the real. Originally, Bernard had asked me to talk about Adorno, and you know, this might seem like flippant, but the argument wouldn't have been very different. For Adorno too, in his little book, Hegel Three Studies, what we need to rescue is the non-conceptual content of the concept. Concepts are always concept of something determinate. And therefore, when we can develop this into a philosophical logic, or even in a science of logic, we should never forget what are the historical determinations that are on which this is based, which it is trying to express, which it is trying to whip into shape, which it is trying to think. So to be is to be intelligible. That means that, yes, the real is rational, because the only thing that we can say about the real is whatever our reason produces. But whatever our reasons produce is never self-positing kind of ideas, but it is determined by our material environment, by our material circumstances that we are trying to think through these forms. And for me, there is not much of, for me personally, there's not much of a difference between a literary form or theory pamphlets or philosophical treatise, even though in the hierarchies of the human sciences or the humanities, they do not all have the same prestige. A novel, a poem, a song, a philosophical statement, they all are forms of the real, trying to make sense or understand the senselessness of our contemporary moment. Now, Rossio begins her book, Hegel's Theory of Intelligibility, by pointing out what were some of these historical events or developments that Hegel is reflecting upon in his philosophy. This preface is called Hegel's Modernism, and her thesis is that Hegel is sort of a modernist, in a very broad sense, philosopher, because he's the philosophy of modernity, of an ambivalent interpretation of modernity. And she follows Hegel, takes him at his word to point out that there's three major events that define modernity. The development of the market economy, the effects of the French Revolution, and the legacy of the Reformation are the concrete conditions that are actualize the distinctively modern understanding of freedom. The modern conception of freedom is accordingly a commitment to self-governance. To be free is to be able to lead one's own life, to have a life of one's own, to be autonomous, to be subject only to norms and institutions that have been authorized by the individual. So, as a methodological principle, one would have to look down or sideways from the logical and philosophical concepts to the historical determinations that they're trying to reflect, that they're trying to make sense of. Just like we cannot understand our present or our past, let alone our future, except through those forms, whatever they are, and the structures, the genre conventions. And I will talk about that a little bit more, because I do believe, Bernard always sort of asks, like, how would you describe your own work? Sometimes I say a philologist, sometimes literary critic, certainly not a philosopher, and it has everything to do with this methodological question. So as a literary critic, I do think we are acutely attuned, and as a translator, to the genre conventions and the structures by which we give form to our present, including the past and future. Or remnants of the past and foreshadowings of the future. So, in this very eloquent preface, in which Rossio insists that we need to understand Hegel's theory of intelligibility as this is the intelligibility of what is. So, thinking and being are the same. Between the logic and history, there is unity. They coincide, as Zhang Xiyin wrote in The Rational Kernel of the Hegelian Dialectic. But then once we start looking at which events or which historical effectivities are being addressed, we end up with the same three events: the Protestant Reformation, the French Revolution, and the birth of capitalism, slightly out of order compared to the chronological developments. Later on, Zambrana insists that we need to think of the relation between the concept and the real as a formalization or theorization of the event. So Hegel's philosophy would be philosophy of the event. Pretty much every philosophy is a philosophy of the event, whether they claim so or not. The perspective of a thought of the event is revealed, and ultimately the possibility for Hegel's philosophy of being entirely inscribed as an event. To be, then, is to be always historically mediated. Historically specific practices, discourse, and institutions articulate concrete forms of understanding nature, self, and society. They articulate what is true in a given society at a given moment in time. This is, of course, an allusion also to that famous line in The Philosophy of Right after the passage on the Isle of Minerva, where Hegel says philosophy is one's own time captured in concepts or in ideas. Right? Here, these forms, historically mediated practice, articulate what is true in a given society at a given moment in time. Philosophy is sort of the meta theory about how this form of intelligibility or general intellect comes into existence. This is for the China in the Hegel in China debate. Some of these hot polemics during the Cultural Revolution that Badiou and his friends comment on. This was one of the big debates. What is the relation between being and thinking? Sort of an abstruse, metaphysical, a seemingly scholastic question, but that for me can be brought down to a very, very simple question. What are ideas of? What are the forms of the real? What real is captured in those forms and in what forms? So we need to think together, being and thinking, history and logic, determinations and definitions. This is a quote from Hegel that Lenin liked to use in his philosophical notebooks. Bestimmungen keine Definitionen. Like determinations, no definitions. Or we could also say no stipulations. You know, the philosophers like to give stipulations. I will call X this or that. And then you set up your little system, your ism, you know, multi-volume construct of the system, you know. Only a few are able to complete what they predicted, and Badiou is very proud that he did complete the 3 volumes of Being Event. But that is a form of stipulating a philosophical system or ism. It is still a formalization of the historical real, of these determinations. But can we go back to those determinations rather than sort of being sucked up in the exegetical questions about how does the Hegel system really function? The different periods, the importance of the words, the shifting meaning, the political developments in his own thought. And the same could be asked about Badiou. Early Badiou, does he abandon Marxism? Does he abandon the dialectic? Does he remain dialectical until the end? Heidegger 1, Heidegger 2, Wittgenstein 1, Wittgenstein 2. As soon as you are at that level, you are no longer talking about historical determinations. You are actually swallowed up like a vacuum by the philosophical system. You are no longer looking at the real. You are looking at the system of concepts that was derived from the real, but it does now constitute an autonomous system. So after the preface, this wonderful preface in Rosier's book, we no longer hear anything about history. We get an intra-philosophical discussion of how Hegel emerges from, Kant, Fichte, Hegel. So we get sort of the revisiting of all the backs and forths between philosophers as though they had a dialogue purely amongst themselves, floating in the air, but pontificating about the true or the idea or the absolute or the self or autonomy or reason versus the intellect and so on. Now, Marx and Engels, when they tried to settle accounts with their own training as Hegelians or as young Hegelians, followed the general trend among all young Hegelians to not fall in the trap of getting sucked into a philosophical system. They said theories never start anything. They never generate any ideas out of their own. They're always formalizations or concepts or deposits or forms of the real, of real historical determinations. So they say we need to start, our manner of approach is not devoid of premises or presuppositions. It starts out from the real premises or presuppositions. I've changed the translation a little bit, and does not abandon them for a moment. The premises or presuppositions from which we begin are not arbitrary ones, not dogmas, but real premises or presuppositions, like wirkliche Voraussetzungen, like actual presuppositions, from which abstraction can only be made in the imagination. They are the real individuals, their activity, and the material conditions of their life, both those which they find already existing and those produced by their activity. All we go back to be is to be intelligible. But the only intelligibility we have about our reality is what we do in practice. And thinking is one practice among others. And they are invocated. They the historical and the logical coincide. To be is to be intelligible, but to be intelligible is also to be, relying on conditions that are already existing out there that you find before you. You did not put them there. These are the conditions that generations before you have put there and have created, in which you are thrown, but then you can also produce by your own activity new conditions, and you can change the existing conditions that you find before you. So if for the young Hegelians, their teacher, Hegel, had the ideal that ultimately philosophy would reach presuppositionless knowledge, like the absolute idea that no longer relies on anything except its own activity of self-positing, with negativity and all that you can add, for a little bit of an existentialist thrill. We'll go back to this, that this is actually not necessarily means that you are, entering the terrain of materialism, let alone of radical political change. It might just be a little frisson that makes people sort of tremble on a Sunday afternoon to remind people that underneath everything, is death bubbling up, and or the death drive, which is how Hegel, as we will discuss, was discussed in the was read in the 1930s and 40s, especially after the lecture by Causer. So we need to. This is a general attitude of all young Hegelians. They said we do not start out from thought. We start out from real presuppositions, and we need to understand that term, like etymologically. You beginning with your language, and as soon as you're born, you find yourself in conditions or premises or presuppositions that are posed there before you, underneath everything you do, and they are real. They're not put there unless you fall into an idealist trap. They are not put there by the activity of reason or thought or thinking alone. Now, among the young Hegelians, there was sort of a divide, and in the German ideology, Marx and Engels referred to this a lot, between this changing fortunes of the different aspects of the Hegelian tradition, where some people insisted more on the sensual, material circumstances that you find before you, as the social being that is out there. So the old materialism that Marx criticizes in the thesis on Feuerbach. So this is a sort of Feuerbachian approach where we want to come back to an appreciation of the sensuous givenness of things as they are before us. This is, in my view, what the new materialism is doing. So the new materialism today is a return to the old materialism that Marx wanted to overcome. On the other side, there were those who believed, look, we're not just determined by our circumstances. Sure, we have these social being determines thought, but at the end, we as subjects can also change the conditions under which we operate. And therefore, we can posit new realities. The I can posit both itself and the not I, sort of the more Fichtean line which Moses Hess would follow. Marx, in the Thesis in Feuerbach, after the German ideology, was trying to see, is there a synthesis possible between those two that is not an idealist philosophical synthesis? Again, one that would not give you a magical solution where you have the best of idealism and the best of materialism, you slam it together, you have a little bit of dialectics, you have a little bit of Feuerbach, you add the activity of the idealist, and boom, you have the Marxist dialectical materialism, as Badiou says, Stalin prize for philosophy, right? When in his, as I say in the introduction, Theory of the Subject is also an extremely funny book, right? And so at some point, if I can find this here, he says, look, if all philosophies are either idealist or materialist and dialectical or metaphysical, that gives us a nice, 4 options, to which, of course, he adds a 5th one, which would be the Kantian kind of idealism with an X, for the thing itself borne out in it. But let me see if I can find this. This is on page 117 in Theory of the Subject. So now we have at our disposal one serious insult, you piece of metaphysical idealist. 2 moderate insults, idealist dialecticians and mechanical materialists. You are on the right track, but on one leg only. And 1 form of praise, materialist dialectician, excellent, you passed the exam, Stalin prize for the piece of concept. This is a joke, because it means it's not about creating the perfect ism, which if you're a philosopher, then you want to trademark, right? Patent your ism. I'm not going to name them because all of those isms are founded by friends of mine. But you get the gist. It's not about finding the peace prize for the piece of concepts. It's about understanding how we can capture those real material presuppositions in which we are all operating. Marx himself is almost tempted to provide us this grand synthesis himself, this summa of a little bit of Feuerbach, the materialist givenness of the object, but also the activity of the subject, for which we have to go to the idealists. And he says, look, this is the famous third thesis, which is probably more important than the 11th one, where he speaks about, teachers also, the educators need to be educated, but that sets up a separation between, those who do the educating and those who are being educated. But then he offers the suggestion of a coincidence, the Zusammenfallen, of the changing of circumstances and of human activity or self-change can be conceived and rationally understood only as revolutionary practice. So this, at the level of theory, here Marx is tempted to, like a bullet, right, for a PowerPoint, to give you a synthesis of these 2 poles and say the changing of the circumstances and the changing of yourself, when those 2 fall together, that's revolutionary practice. The risk, however, is that formulating that synthesis takes the place of actual transformative actions, which is what ends up happening in a lot of philosophical treatments of these texts, which is why I'm still in the detour before we get to Badiou. Now, again, laudable principle that Rossio presents. This book focuses on Hegel's theoretical philosophy in order to show that what Hegel calls a logic and also proper metaphysics is a theory of intelligibility that responds to the ambivalent development of modernity. So the the logical intelligibility needs to be tied in with the question about historical effectivity, in this case, modernity, which Hegel understands as ambivalent and precarious. But again, there's only 3 events that actually enter. It's a very narrow window through which only 3 events can be captured, and they happen to be the same 3 events that Hegel constantly refers to as the founding events of sort of the end of history, which happens to occur in the present for him. The Protestant Reformation, capitalism, the French Revolution. Where, I mean, Rocio Zambrana is a decolonial thinker from Puerto Rico. Where are other events, such as the conquest and colonization of America? Since we are, after all, speaking from the Americas. Now, ironically, in a second book, we get sort of the flip side of this, in which Rocio then focuses exclusively on the operations of liberal colonialism in Puerto Rico, taking Puerto Rico as a case study for what, you know, colonial debts, for what she calls neoliberal coloniality, drawing on decolonial thought and praxis. She shows how that functions as an apparatus of predation that transforms how neoliberalism operates. I bring this to your attention because, not as a critique, but because I identify with this division of labor. When Rocio Zambrano, the philosopher, speaks, there's not a single mention of America, or of the fact that her place of enunciation is between Puerto Rico and the mainland, US. When she speaks as a decolonial thinker in Puerto Rico, there may be occasional references to Hegel, but there's no statement, there's no philosophical treatment of the move from Kant to Fichte to Hegel. And so you have these different hats, which you only have if you're working on these peripheral, so-called peripheral, they're quite central area of studies, but about which you don't have to worry if you can speak, again, without mentioning from where you speak, if you're located in France, Germany, or sometimes Italy. So my question is, could we put these books together? Could we sort of see if they can be articulated? Just like the logical and the historical need to be articulated, to be according to her own theory about intelligibility, to be is to be intelligible. So we need to tie the theory of intelligibility to the long-term history of the history of capitalism and colonialism. Now, lo and behold, Hegel gives us a clue. Hegel himself talks more about America than all the Hegelians. So, in the Lectures on the Philosophy of World History, Hegel doesn't really know what to do with America. Of course, America has already been discovered as being colonized. He knows about the abolitionist debates. He justifies a form of natural slavery for the time being until it can be a proper liberal state, at which point, of course, slavery will be abolished. So what to do with America? It's both a past that he is divided about, because he likes the Protestant North American revolution, which he believes has been better because it had been colonized, while South America, he says, has only been conquered and has never managed to develop the same civil institutions, liberties, and class differences that would lead to the lifting up of spirit. So what does he do? Tucks it away in the introduction about the geographic basis of history. So before he starts talking about the giant forward march of spirit in a philosophy of history, he needs to do something. He's saying history is coming to an end right now, Napoleon under my window. This is the culmination of, the idea of freedom, the externalization and Erinnerung, the reintegration or a recollection of freedom and the self. So America, I'm going to put it away in geography, but I'm going to add, and this is sort of a symptomatic slippage, I'm going to say that it's the land of the future. And both terms are very important. Das Land der Zukunft. So it's both a land, because it's too tied to nature. There's open lands and pristine, unoccupied, without industriousness. There's too much land still to conquer and occupy in the Americas, and therefore spirit has not yet been concentrated and weighed down by becoming compact, which would force it to lift itself up from nature. So it's too close to the ground. It hasn't been sublimated yet, it hasn't been purified, it hasn't been lifted up. So he will say, America is therefore the land of the future, where in the ages that lie before us, the burden of the world's history shall reveal itself, perhaps in a contest between North and South America, or between Protestantism and Catholicism. And he was right about that. And it is a land of desire for all those who are aware of the historical lumber room of old Europe. Napoleon is reported to have said, "Cette vieille Europe m'ennuie." It is for America to abandon the ground on which it hitherto the history of the world has developed itself. What has taken place in the New World, because he knows he should talk about that. But he says, well, that's just been up to the present and only an echo of the old world. The expression of a foreign life. And as a land of the future, it has no interest for us here, for as regards history, our concern must be with that which has been and that which is. In regard to philosophy, on the other hand, we have to do with that which, strictly speaking, is neither past nor future, but with that which is, which has an eternal existence with reason. And this is quite sufficient to occupy us. So I want to draw your attention to this. It's like a magician's sleight of hand, but he's showing you the trick. Because America's there. He didn't just elide it from the philosophy of history. He could have not talked about it, but he needs to talk about it. Since the history is going to move from east to west, from Asia to Europe, he knows that will continue into the further west, which now we call the Western Hemisphere, after 1898, with the loss of the last Spanish colonies, when the world power sort of shifts and the normals of the earth, in Carl Schmitt's terms, shifts towards the United States, and therefore a new idea, not just the West, but the Western Hemisphere. And at that point, history will continue in the New World, in the Americas. But he puts it away in a geographic base because it's tied to the land. Again, methodologically, you can say he does show you that the territorial determinations of the life of the spirit are the fundamental basis from which history arises. So you do have to understand history based on the appropriation of land. Landnahme, which for Carl Schmitt is also the fundamental act of history, which establishes the nomos, or the law of the land, the lay of the land. And Schmitt makes this sort of connection etymologically between nemen, Landnahme, taking, and nomos, nemen, the making of a law. It needs to be rooted in a concrete space, in the land. But if it sticks too closely to that, it is just like animal life on the earth. You need to lift yourself up as a thinking human being in order to sublimate and purify the spirit. Now, José Ortega y Gasset, from the generation 1898, so-called because of the drama or tragedy of the loss of the last Spanish colonies, has talked about the paradox of this passage in the Lectures on World Philosophy in an essay called Hegel and America. And he says, America places Hegel's historical thought in a dramatic, or better still, paradoxical situation. When an idea suffers from itself and contains in its pained interior a logical drama, it adopts the theatrical mask of paradox. But the paradox lies not in the fact that Hegel eliminates America, the future, I repeat, from the properly historical corpus. Rather, being unable to situate America either in the present or the past proper, he is compelled to lodge it where, you might ask? Why? In prehistory or in geography. So on the one hand, America, according to Hegel, belongs less to history than to geography, serving as the prehistoric foundation or natural ground for the global development of the spirit. So in the expression, the land of the future, full weight must be given to the fact that we are speaking of a geographical expanse. Here, das Land does not bear the sense of a nation or a nation state. Something which America, according to Hegel precisely, is not yet, though it may become one in the future, particularly in the Protestant North, as distinct from the Catholic South. But rather, Land, or das Land, must be understood in the sense of a land or territory, the terra firma, or tierra firme, discovered by Columbus in the New World. Indeed, according to Hegel, America has not yet sufficiently detached itself from the terrestrial ground to merit a pivotal place in the universal history of the spirit. Here, the spirit has not yet taken flight. rising above the finite things of nature in terms of a supra or supernatural freedom. For this reason, America remains inert, a prehistoric entity, a continent external to world history proper. Or, as I put it in the epigraph, that for America, the only principle that remains is to be that of incompleteness or constant non-fulfillment, the not yetness of the spirit of the people in the Americas. On the other hand, though, by nonetheless granting America a possible future within his philosophy of history, Hegel contradicts his own tendency to associate the present of his time, let us say in general the post-Napoleonic era, translated into the speculative terms of German idealism, with the end of history. So he's now saying there is a future after the end of history. So another slippage where the magician shows, you can see like the rabbit sticking out of his head, right? Now, if we as readers and interpreters perpetuate this tendency, repeating it in our reception of the German thinker, then precisely there will be no future to be found in Hegel, since his philosophy of history would then be concerned solely with the past and the eternal present. As Ortega y Gasset writes, only from the standpoint of the present, and in light of what our own life signifies to us, is it possible, according to Hegel, to justify past epochs. It is the mindset of a pharaoh gazing down an anthill of laborers toiling to construct his pyramid. This is pretty much all that Adorno says in his little book, Hegel, Three Studies. The concept is based on the labor of the negative, and it is called labor because it is based on the toil of human sweat and labor. And so the material aspects, sort of the material dregs of the concept, are what we need to dig up as the experiential concept, the experiential content behind every concept in Hegel's system. To this mindset, the Hegelian system owes its closed character, devoid of evolution beyond itself, devoid of a tomorrow. Yet precisely this lack of futurity is not what emerges from Hegel's encounter or non-encounter with America. Contrary to the widely held view regarding the closed nature of Hegelian logic, America opens Hegel's philosophy of history towards an unforeseeable future. So America, as something future and unfinished, stands as irrefutable proof that the spirit may well continue its march from east to west on the other side of the Atlantic, carrying the providential idea of Christianity, particularly in the Protestant version of the Germanic nations of Northern Europe, into the New World. This is all Hegel's perspective, as betrayed in this slip of the pen in the introductory segment on the geographical base of history. This prospective possibility contradicts the common prejudice regarding the closed nature of the Hegelian conception of history, viewed as a logical system with no future, fixed in what is as an eternal present that reveals the cancellation and sublation of all the previous epochs of what has been in the past. Now, strangely, if America, as the land of the future, bears witness to the openness of Hegel's thought and kind of explains why we're discussing Hegel and versions and inversions of Hegel today in the Americas, because it points towards what lies ahead. It is more than legitimate to ask ourselves why the American continent is conspicuously absent from Catherine Malabou's book, The Future of Hegel, Plasticity, Temporality, and Dialectic. So another friend, a dear friend, Catherine, says, against the common prejudice that Hegel is a closed system of spirit all eternally by itself, there is a future of Hegel because there's a future in Hegel. He is a thinker who sees the future coming. And so, in a work entirely dedicated to refuting the prejudice that casts Hegel as the last of the metaphysical thinkers of vulgar or ordinary time, as an eternal present or now devoid of any tomorrow, Malabou now affirms Hegel's future in two senses. On the one hand, Hegel's philosophy is neither dead nor a mere relic of the past, but rather possesses an entire future lying before it. This is precisely because, on the other hand, it is a mode of thinking whose plasticity constantly opens itself up to receive at its very core that which is yet to come. So another paradox. This is an attempt to open up Hegel's philosophy to think about the present and the future according to a system that was supposed not to allow this. And yet, surprisingly, she does not devote even a single mention to America, which is described by Hegel himself as land of the future. And then second, if we now ask which historical determinations are taken into account in Malabou's account, we get even a narrower set of events than in the case of Rossio. According to her reading, Hegel is uniquely capable of seeing what is coming, voir venir, like seeing, when you say to someone like, I see you coming, like, you're not going to fool me, I know what you're going to do, but also you're open to see what, I'm curious to see what's coming. So it's between those two meanings of, you already are smarter and you know exactly. Hegel at the beginning of the book on Lectures of World History says, I know the end. So the end is already in the beginning because he has seen the whole. But it is also, according to Malabou, an openness to the plasticity of time that allows for surprises from the future. In French, he says the phrase voir venir, to see what is coming, signifies. Oh yeah, so this is not actually there. Sorry. Waiting prudently while observing the unfolding of events, yet also divining a person's intentions and penetrating their designs. Consequently, this expression denotes at one and the same time both being certain of what is coming, I see you coming, and not knowing what will come. Let's see what's coming. Thus, voir venir comes to designate the interplay, the joint operation of teleological necessity and surprise within Hegelian philosophy. So, for a book so committed to the idea of a future in and of Hegel, it is surprising to say the least that there's not a single mention of America as a country of the future, or as the land of the future. In fact, what she sees coming through Hegel is a much narrower panorama than that of the author of the Lectures on the Philosophy of World History. It's basically limited to two moments, the Greek moment and the modern moment, with Christianity being the pivot in between. I won't quote this. Just the conclusion to that passage. To see what is coming, which is the originary possibility of all encounter, of all thinking the new, thinking the surprise event, the advent of something new, the structure of subjective anticipation is not the same in every moment of its history. It does not see what is coming in the same way. It does not have the same future. Subjectivity comes itself, advient, it advenes, it is kind of an adventure, in two fundamental moments, the Greek moment and the modern moment, which prove to be both in their logical unity and in their chronological succession, first subject as substance, and then substance as subject. So you reread just two-pronged history of world philosophy, or philosophy of world history, based on a Greek moment and a modern moment. The bridge between is covered by 15 centuries, over which she leaps with like 7 league, boots, without any mention. So even in this plastic interpretation of speculative philosophy, the enormous diversity of encyclopedic knowledge reflected in the Lectures on the Philosophy of World History, or even the Phenomenology of Spirit, is reduced to a much more limited and Eurocentric vision than Hegel's own. Because after all, he does talk quite a bit about Asia and about Africa, even in denigrative terms, and about America, as we just saw. However schematic it may have been, Hegel had at least attempted to integrate the world of Asia into the advance of the spirit from east to west. Now, I want to suggest that this is actually a sound methodological principle that you can see reiterated in one philosophical system after another. If you ask a philosopher, when does modernity begin? And I do this in my class, and I'm very happy to see many of the students in the senior seminar where we had this exercise. You usually get the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, maybe somebody will say Reformation if they have read a little bit of Hegel, and the days, 1776, 1789, or 19th century for technological and industrial revolution. If they are trained in sort of decolonial thinking and have read Enrique Dussel, Sylvia Wynter, or Denise Ferreira da Silva, then they might say 1492. But what happens with 1492? The same as what happens in Hegel. It is mentioned, displaced, and then erased as this is prehistory, this is geography. This is not yet, but it is also the land of the future. So there's a double movement going on here of establishing a cut between that which came before, that which might anticipate a future that we don't know yet, but then camouflaging or hiding or erasing that which is cut off from the modern, which happened to coincide with the end of history in Europe. This is fundamentally Enrique Dussel's argument in his lectures, his Frankfurt lectures in 1992 for the 5th centenary of the so-called discovery or descubrimiento of the New World. And he says, 1492 is the date of the birth of modernity, in quotation marks, although its gestation involves a preceding intra-Uterine process of growth. The possibility of modernity originated in the free cities of medieval Europe, which were centers of enormous creativity, but modernity as such was born, again in quotation marks, when Europe was in a position to pose itself against another, when in other words, Europe could constitute itself as a unified ego, exploring, conquering, colonizing an alterity that gave back its image of itself. This other, in other words, was not discovered or descubierto or admitted as such, but concealed or covered up, encubierto, as the same as what Europe assumed it had always been. It's a distant echo of the old world. Everything that has happened so far in the new world is only an echo of the old world. Nothing new to be seen. But Hegel knows he has to mention it, so it does appear at the beginning of the philosophy of history. So if 1492 is the moment of the birth of modernity as a concept, the moment of origin of a very particular myth of sacrificial violence, it also marks the origin of a process of concealment or misrecognition of the non-European. Now, I would like to argue this is not simply a decolonial view of the birth of modernity. It is a methodological principle that I would like to keep in mind when I read Hegel or any other philosophy. The relation between America and Hegel, for me, is equivalent to the relation between the real and the concept. Let me explain that. As soon as you want to posit modernity, and my student Skylar Glock has just finished his honors thesis about this very operation, looking at modernity as kind of a narrative mode. So we have a lot of going back and forth. I no longer distinguish exactly what is his and what is mine, which is for the better, because it's a common, attempt to think through problems that we should try to move away from proper names, or from the possessive individualism of I thought. But as soon as you set up a modernity, you need to establish a cut for when modernity begins, and therefore there needs to be something when modernity begins, the so-called birth, which immediately turns that which comes before into the pre-modern. And if you're efficient, you can call it early modern, right? And then how early can you get? It's like 5th century early modernity. And of course, all the connotations that come with it. Modernity means autonomy, change, lifting up of the spirit versus stagnation, tradition, being tied to nature and to the land, right? Now, Marx knew that this was also the way in which capitalism itself came into existence. Capitalism didn't bring itself, or the free market, which is one of the 3 events that Rosillo mentions in her book on Hegel's theory of intelligibility, did not bring itself into existence. It depended on the contingent, aleatory falling together, zusammenfallen, of 2 major conditions or premises. Free labor, which is an ironic euphemistic concept. free because it had to be freed from all other communal determinations, to be thrown as, purchasable wage labor in the urban centers, and money accumulated as capital. Those conditions, the presuppositions for the transformation of money into capital, appear as the given, external presuppositions for the emergence of capital. But as soon as capital has become capital, it creates its own presuppositions, namely the possession of the real conditions for the creation of new values without exchange by means of its own production process. So there is, just like philosophy knows that it is based on historical determinations, but then kind of forgets it and erases that and lifts itself up into the absolute idea, similarly, this is what capitalism does. So every critique of capitalism in Marx is also a critique of philosophy. This is why I do want to thematize the problem of functioning within these disciplinary confines of so-called philosophy. So capitalism points back to its presupposition, which it did not create, but finds before it: free labor and money as capital. The value cycle and everything that capitalism posits, and that you hear, and when it's election season again, that CEOs create jobs and so on. That creating, that positing, supposedly happening from within capitalism, should lift itself up like Münchhausen, by pulling on its own hair. Once this new phenomenon of the free market economy comes into existence, it actually creates the illusion that it brought itself into existence and was independent of any prior presuppositions. The conditions and presuppositions of the becoming, of the emergence of capital, imply precisely that it is not yet in being, but only becoming. Hence, they disappear with the development of real capital, which, setting out from its own reality, itself posits the conditions for its realization. This is a little, jargony, but this is 1857, 1858. Supposedly, Marx has already made, a strong cut, a radical break with his Hegelianism, and yet he constantly relies on the logic of the positing of the presuppositions to explain how capitalism works. This is why we had all these books like Hiroshi Uchida about Marx's Grundrisse and Hegel's logic. For Marx, Hegel's logic is the logic of capital, and therefore it is the logical choice to go through those same motions to explain the motion, the Kreislauf, the cycle of value production under capitalism. These presuppositions, which originally appeared as prerequisites of its becoming, and therefore could not arise from its action as capital, now appears as results of its own realization, reality as posited by it, not as conditions of its emergence, but as results of its being. This is when political economists like Adam Smith can talk about production and the economy and exchange and the market and so on as such, in general, as though they appeared out of nowhere and are eternally true for all economic and social forms. So capitalism, even though it was based on those presuppositions, posits itself and sees itself as self-positing, just like the Hegelian concept as absolute idea perceives itself as presuppositionless. So the same critique that you have to apply to the social formation in which we currently live, you also have to apply to the methods by which we study those formations, whether you call it, critique of political economy, critical theory, or philosophy. But as a result, this is sort of my hypothesis here. The relation between American Hegel is the same as the relation between the real and the concept. They're based on a scission or a cut and the retroactive erasure or cover-up of that which was presupposed, but then is taken to be the result of its own being. For example, whatever is pre-modern is described as primitive, barbarous, heteronymous, and therefore not worthy of being included in the philosophy of history, but tucked away into the geography, which is where Hegel talks about Africa and about America. But this very operation, as we saw when we saw the rabbit in the magician's hand, it's almost never a failure to see sort of where the seams are showing, the concept is still determined by history. And therefore, there are no pure concepts. I didn't have time to translate this, but this is from an Argentine philosopher who recently passed away, painter and poet, Oscar del Barco, about whom I have written quite a bit. And he wrote this amazing book in the early 80s in exile in Mexico, El Otro Marx. And he has this concept of the borra. Now, at home, my wife says that this is not really, the meaning of borra in Mexico, but he plays on the word borra, which means like borra del café, like dregs, like coffee dregs in a cup, from which you can read the future, and borradura, the erasure. So he plays on the fact that even when there is the erasure of the historical determinacies in the philosophical concept, you will still find traces or dregs of the concept that you have to lean into, that you have to open up. Rather than ignoring them, that's where you need to focus so that we are not sucked up into the vacuum that is the philosophical system. All these breaks or pure developments of the concept cannot avoid what they drag along behind them, their point of the wheel, the dregs. Behind the apparent obviousness of everything that the real man do or think or dreams, that is real, we can also see hidden these dregs that are not so obvious, based on which we need to sort of think about the non-conceptual, the non-discursive, and that is the other side of Marx, not the systematic Marx. Or rather, it explains why Marx never wrote a systematic treatise, why we don't have the 16 pages on the dialectic that he promised and that everybody else would like to reconstruct. This is not only because of the time constraints and the financial constraints and the other burdens of life, or a certain sprawling nature of his writing, but it also has to do that there is no reason to turn this into a philosophical system or into a philosophical treatise, because you're trying to grab onto those coffee dregs of the concept. Now, let me give you a few examples of where other philosophers have actually pointed this out, including about Hegel. Martin Heidegger, in one of his seminars in 1968, incidentally, says, "We recall in this connection that according to Hegel's own words, it is with Descartes that philosophy treads for the first time upon that festus land, terra firma, solid ground, which is consciousness. The difference between Descartes and Hegel is that Descartes merely sets foot on it, whereas Hegel measures it through and through. Descartes discovers this ground in the Meditationes de Prima Philosophia, and Hegel surveys it throughout his system of science, i.e. in phenomenology, just as in the three parts of the logic. Of course, in this surveying, in this Hegelian geometry, which measures the ground of consciousness in its totality, there is no question of a mathematical measurement. The measurement is metaphysical, i.e. and total, i.e. absolute." So even Heidegger reminds us that every time Hegel mentions Descartes in his history of philosophy, he says Descartes with the cogito or the doubt found an unshakable foundation, fundamentum inconcusum, and that is similar, and the metaphor is consistent throughout, to discovering the new land, the tierra firme of the new world. So again, we can read, this is a vulgar reading, which is pretty much all I do, a vulgar reading of the history of philosophy, and Jose Pablo Feynman has done this in an excursus in his book on Filosofía y Nación, where you read next to one another the move from Descartes to Kant to Hegel, as how it corresponds to the historical developments of the increasing conquest, colonization, and internalization of the New World by European colonial forces. So this is announced, another rabbit that we can see poking out of under somebody's coat, but then very quickly erased and omitted so that we can go back to either celebrating or criticizing the self-positing power of the cogito. Kant, in his groundworks for the metaphysics of morals, himself says, well, if we want to have pure concepts of morality or a priori concepts, we need to cleanse. We need to, have this rein. We need to make this reinlich. We need to purify this. Otherwise, you're a bungler or a jack of all trades, which again I am being right now because I'm dragging you away from the noble philosophical system about Hegel and the idea and the dialectical logic by talking about pedestrian, vulgar, material circumstances such as the division of labor. Now, Kant says that we need a division of labor between the empirical and transcendental. And he uses the example of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, which he had just read. So the possibility of Kantian pure knowledge, of the critique of pure reason or the critique of practical reason or metaphysics of moral, is based on the material circumstances of the division of labor. That is what makes a priori thinking possible. Or we can go further back. Derrida's oldest son, Pierre Alfieri, wrote this marvelous book on Willem of Ockham, subtitled The Singular, saying with Ockham, we see some kind of an ontological revolution where the only thing that exists is the singular this or that. And everything general or common is now just a semiotic convention. So nominalism, he says, is a complete revolution, and he uses the metaphor, again, this is the rabbits, this is the dregs of the concept that poke out. He says this is a new ontological cadastre, like a new tax map of the lay of the land, as in the movement of enclosures, that take away and destroy the commons and produce that from that moment on, the only thing that exists, this is my land, this is your land. This is my idea, this is your idea. And therefore, every time we celebrate the singular, the experience of the singularity, we are in fact, praying before the altar of the destruction of the commons. We're actually participating in the movement of the enclosures. Or we can go further back. We can go to Parmenides. And in Heidegger's attempt to go back to the pre-Socratics, that still had a sense of the withdrawing presencing of ousia, or being, or substance, as it was badly translated according to Heidegger in the Romanization and in the Scholastics. But he knows, and he mentions in his seminar on Parmenides, that ousia in Greek just means small chattel or capital, the inheritable small possessions, including slaves. So again, the most noble concept of ontology, of first philosophy, is actually a pedestrian term that refers to small capital. This is an attempt to read philosophy materially from the point where the concept points to the non-conceptual, experiential, and historical content. So this is where the Malabou is located. So now let's go to Badiou and Hegel and Badiou. I did this long detour because I have not taught a course on Badiou, and we did one section of about 1 hour, and Uriel, who's here, did that, and it was wonderful, but I still feel extremely frustrated every time you discuss Badiou, precisely for the reasons that I pointed out, which is you are actually erasing that whole background in order to focus on a philosophical system, whether it's Hegel's or Badiou's, and the coincidences or discrepancies between them. He himself points out in his in one of the two prefaces, Tzuchien, the translator, explains why he changed the format of this book, which I thought was maybe unfortunate, because in Badiou's edition and that of his friends, Joël Belassin and Louis Mousseau, they have the text in translation and then at the bottom footnotes, and it's sometimes difficult because they overflow, they go to the next page, but it also means that the page is divided into two, just like you have two prefaces. So everything splits up into two, right? And then the content of what the argument is actually the dialectic is a logic of decision. So I think this is lost when you put everything away into the back with endnotes. Hegel is referring to the fact of how has Hegel been read. Badiou is referring to the way in which Hegel has been read in France up to that point. And he established sort of two traditions that are tied to the choice of books. One tradition focused on the phenomenology of spirit because it gives you the dialectic of lord and bondsman, or master and slave, as is mistranslated, or sort of, the tarrying with death and the whole existential aspects of labor and the struggle for recognition and strife and negativity and the night of the world. What's not to like if you kind of a post-romantic, surrealist, auditor in these lecture courses by Alexandre Kojève that Georges Bataille attended, that Jacques Lacan attended, and that pretty much, the who's of the French, intelligentsia was attending at the time, because it was kind of like a rock concert. And then came in Althusser with sort of a dry, brutal transiency, isolating it from that entire subjectivist tradition. The subject now is completely ideological, so there is no such thing as a phenomenology of consciousness, right? Or it's pure ideology and humbug. And putting it back in the saddle as positive knowledge, like scientific, structural knowledge, formations of knowledge, theory with a capital T. At the same time, Marx and Hegel, even though in opposite terms, found themselves no less foreclosed than the previous moment. The latter, Hegel, insofar as unilateral figure taken as a target, by the same token find itself vindicated. The materialist Hegel of the greater logic is equally mute for Althusser and for Sartre. And for the former, for Marx, insofar as once adapted to the concept of structuralism, he gained in scientificity what he lost in terms of class historicity. So this is sort of pick your book, right? What's your favorite book? And so Badiou says, nobody's reading the science of logic. That's actually kind of a formalization of a metaphysical system that could lead the way out of the subjective drama of existentialist and psychoanalytical reading of the phenomenology. Fine. The Hegelianized Marx of the 50s was a speculative figure, but remained virtue revolutionary. While the anti-Hegelian Marx of the 60s, Althusser, was a scholar devoted to the seminars, or meant for the seminar room. Or to put the alternatives philosophically, the Marx-Hegel was the idealist dialectic, and the anti-Hegel Marx was metaphysical materialism. I don't know where 1313 fits in this the seminar of 1313. And what he's going to try to do, and what he suggests, is not just a subjective decision, but the result of trying to listen to the events of May 68 in France and the Cultural Revolution in China, is that we need to understand at the level of the masses that what was needed is something other than the oscillation between two national intellectual traditions, the Descartes of the cogito, Sartre, and the Descartes of the machine, Althusser, for reinvesting in a Marxism of the real, right, of actual struggles. In truth, we should begin again at zero, from scratch, and to ultimately see philosophically that Marx is neither the same nor the other of Hegel, but rather his divider, diviseur. He simultaneously assigns its irreversible validity, the rational kernel of the dialectic, and its integral falsity, the idealist system. And these are the stakes of the debate and of their return. So he's a disciple of Althusser, for whom, if you remember, January 1968, Derrida gives his talk on the pit and the pyramid in Jean Hippolyte's seminar on Hegel and modern thinking, which is sort of a theory of the sign and semiology in Hegel. A month later, for the same Société Française de Philosophie, Althusser gives his talk on the rapport, the relation between Marx and Hegel, right? Sort of saying it's a new practice of philosophy. But at the same time, we need to get rid of Hegel. So Badiou was a Sartrean student of Althusser. So he embodies this double tradition. But he does not go the path of the phenomenology spirit. He goes the path of like mathematical, formalized systems, as in the science of logic. And then he says, if we push, especially the early parts in all the syllogisms, then we can see that there is a materialist kernel hiding in all of Hegel's dialectic. But it depends on how you define the dialectic. And we need to avoid two deviations. This is very important to understand the political and historical context or determinations in which this intervention is situated. We need to avoid the idealist romanticist deviation, let's call it a leftist adventurous deviation, but also the scientific academic deviation, let's call it the reformist or structuralist deviation. And finally, also the all-out hatred of Marxism, which was that of the new philosophers, who sort of blamed the Gulag and the totalitarian state on the maître penseurs, on the master thinkers, who single-handedly, in this completely idealistic view of history, were responsible for the disasters and calamities of the 20th century. So here's what I would add. Just as a, not saying everybody now should study the philosophy of history, but rather think back on the methodological moves that I suggested when we understand that whether it's the more existential forms of mind in the phenomenology of spirit or the formalizations in the science of logic, we should still keep in mind that they are forms of the real, as suggested in that little chapter tucked away about the geographic base of history, in which America appears as land of the future. And this is then the major, the moment where he tries to shift the way we read Hegel. There are two dialectical matrices in Hegel. This is what turns the famous story of the shell and the kernel into such a dubious enigma. It is the kernel itself that is cracked, as in those peaches, like French peaches, that are furthermore so irritating to eat, whose hard internal object quickly cracks between one's teeth into two pivoting halves. Again, it's metaphorical, but it is also giving you like the almost palpable, physical, material sense. You can almost, savor the, peaches in France in June or July in the South, which now turns out that the kernel itself is split. So the kernel of the Hegelian dialectic is split because the dialectic is a logic of splitting, not of alienation and the return home, not of negation and the negation of the negation, or not even as sublation, conservation, annihilation, and preservation all at once, which is the object of Derrida's major critique. In that same year of 1968, when I think in February, he gave his talk on La Différence, where he said, ultimately, La Différence, in the way he says, is the reply or the undoing of every moment of the Hegelian Aufhebung or Relève. Even though, he says, it is also possible to read Hegel at like an infinitesimal distance from what deconstruction is trying to suggest, because there's other ways in which Hegel kind of betrays the finite nature of his own thinking, that he cannot really get to the good infinity, and he's constantly bogged down by the bad infinity or by the elements of finitude, the passions, nature, external oppositions between the finite and the infinite, and so on and so forth. So this is the task that Badiou lays out at the beginning of the year of the subject. At the heart of the Hegelian dialectic, we must disentangle two processes, two concepts of movement, and not just one proper view of becoming that would have been corrupted by a subjective system of knowing. So there's first, this is the traditional view, a dialectical matrix covered by the term of alienation. All the people that were reading either Koževa's lectures or Marx's manuscripts of 1844 go this path. The idea of a simple term which unfolds itself in its becoming other, in its externalization, in order to come back to itself as an achieved concept. And then there's another matrix, which is of course the one that he wants to propose, whose operator is scission, and whose theme is that there is no unity that is not split. There is not the least bit of return into itself, nor any connection between the final and the inaugural. Not even integral communism as the return after the externalization into the states, to the concept of which primitive communism would be the simple immediacy. These are affirmations that, of course, also appear, for which you can call authoritative quotations from either Lenin or Mao, such as the splitting in two of a single whole and the cognition of its contradictory parts is the essence, one of the essentials, one of the principal, if not the principal characteristics or features of dialectics. In brief, dialectics can be defined as the doctrine of the unity of opposites. This grasps the kernel of dialectics, but it requires explanations and developments. And then Mao quotes these things as well, particularly Lenin's line in the philosophical notebooks: dialectics in the proper sense is the study of contradiction in the very essence of objects. So now, instead of looking at something as a pure self-positive entity, you need to look at the contradictions within it to sort of unravel and put it in connection with its opposites, with its history, with the struggle that is taking place, the unevenness within any given entity. There is nothing that does not contain contradiction. Without contradiction, nothing would exist. Or again, and Althusser quotes this in his 1965 articles in Pour Marx: nothing in this world develops absolutely evenly. We must oppose the theory of even development or the theory of equilibrium. So it's not, let's find a nice piece of the concept, a synthesis of subject and object, or a little bit of materialism, a little bit of idealism, a little bit of Feuerbach, a little bit of X. No, there's constant uneven and struggle going on. Things flip over, things turn over, things change, or things fall back and lapse back into stagnancy, inertia, or in exaggerated deviations of sort of left-wing adventurism. And this is the concept, the context in which Badiou is proposing this reading of Hegel. It becomes a little technical, for which I apologize, and I wasn't sure. This is something that you should do on a blackboard, or if somebody wants to help me turn this into videos of how these things, because it's not static. It's about there's how does the qualitative process actually happen? I need to sort of find a way of making a moving image of these steps. First of all, we must posit a constitutive schism. Anything that is, any given entity A is actually defined by itself as what it is, supposedly, and itself as something else, as determined by the sum totality of determinations that you find before you. You yourself, supposedly the person that writes in the diary, and then you as interpolated and marked by everything, Colombia, United States, political, personal, psychological, linguistic determinations. That's where the contradiction is in every single thing. We should never think about something as pure itself only. The index P, it refers back to the space of placement. This is espace, like a portmanteau word that he created. This is a crazy book in which he invents new words, and the most important ones are espace and hors lieu in one word. So espace means like espace de place. It means the space of all placements. Like, where would you place yourself? Well, there's, you can say that concentric circles, you can say institutional determinations, family determinations, class determinations. That's the sum total of all the places that assign you an identity as something as seen through that and mediated through that framework of intelligibility. And that is called, the place or place for, so P, the site of any possible reduplication of A. Note that this does not have to be spatial or geometrical. The reduplication can be temporal or even fictive. It can be a question about desire. It can be literary. But that's just the static starting point. That is a statement of fact. There is no such thing as an even development. Everything contains contradictions. If A equals the split entity of A and AP, this is determined by the indexical effect of P on A. We will thus write, this new formula as the first, in which sort of AP is the determining element of those two, as the first notation of determination of decision, the first algorithm of the unity of opposites. In other words, what Hegel calls Bestimmung, determination. This is all based on the first chapters on the science of logic, Etwas and Anderes, where Hegel describes this very basic sort of move on what anything is and what anything is as perceived, as such. Bestimmung is in turn divided by what it unifies. It is a major strength of the dialectic to grasp how the one of the unity of contraries supports contrariness in its very being. It runs through everything. Why is this so important? So I can't, okay. Because this is where it becomes a movement. This is where it becomes operationalized. You never have the opposition between pure A and P, between this S plus, this place, and the outplace, the hors lieu. Let's say, to use an example from a popular culture, you have all these movies these days about like Divergence, Hunger Games, and so on, which are very platonic because they basically assign, you know, like the myth of the metals. They assign a function to you. You're a helper, you're a warrior, and so on. And of course, the plot is always that there's divergent people that don't fit into any of these classes. Those divergent people are like the hors lieu, the outplaces. They do not feel that they are part of society. So they say, that society out there, this gray world, that is set up with a strict hierarchy where I can only do what I was born to do, I'm going to be different. So it's an affirmation of difference with regard to the place that's out there. But that actually does not exist. That's sort of an inert, inoperative opposition or a form of the contradiction that is not actually existing. The only thing that exists is the work of division and scission within a given entity, which is the second stage of decision. Determination is that moment where we have to understand that what really determines who and what we are is that totality of historical and political determinations in which we are embedded constantly, whether it's at the university, in the workplace, in a political organization, or at home. And then, if you understand that actually, well, it's always Colombia, it's always the United States, and there's no escape. The powers that be always recuperate all these divergencies. They always sort of make them into alt this or that. It sells. So in the end, nothing actually changes. It's just dominant place reaffirms itself and swallows you up. So that's the rightist relapse, the retombée. It's like the pessimism or the nihilism of saying nothing is possible. There's only one system. There is no alternative because anything you do will be, recuperated and commodified. But you need to sort of look at this as a continuation. If the bottom line of strict determination continues in the second row, you can actually then try to think, what is it within our own split identity that works against those determinations, and in a form of torsion, like a working back upon oneself, you can actually try to destroy and change those elements that are determining who and what you are. That is the moment of torsion or limitation. If then you exaggerate in the other extreme to say, aren't we cool? Aren't we pure? Aren't we the real alternative? And everything else is corrupt and neo-fascist and the big bad administration. Then you fall into the leftist extreme. Remember those deviations that he was pointing out at the beginning? This is the political and historical context in which he's mobilizing the dialectic as a logic of scission. It is politically inoperative to fall in left or right-wing forms of libertarianism, of us versus them, or of A versus P. He goes further. Rigorously speaking, contradiction does not exist. That seems to be the opposite of what Mao just said. There's no such thing that nothing exists that's not contradictory. Now he says, rigorously speaking, contradiction does not exist. How could it exist, since to exist is precisely to be something, that is to support the scission effect of which contradiction is the cause. Contradiction is a pure structural principle. So to say that, which is an exercise that some deconstructive or post-structuralist readers are well versed in, to sort of study the constitutive exclusion on which any entity is based does not change the situation. It just points out that there is a contradiction here. But there's a structural principle. The only thing in which we can understand it is that it insists in the index of P on A. It marks repetition. But nowhere do you have a real existing conflict between A and P as constituted in isolatable terms. Contradiction has no other mode of existence but scission. In concrete militant philosophy, it is thus indispensable to announce that there is only one law of the dialectic, one divides into two. There was a slogan, the philosophical debate in China was, what is the right slogan? One divides into two or two fuse into one? And the Cultural Revolution was, of course, proposing one divides into two as their choice. I'm almost finished, but this doesn't move forward. Yeah. I would say, though, that today, that's exactly where we are. After tragedy and farce, the third time is melodrama. Conspiracy theories, us versus them, force versus place, agency, good old agency against structure, movementism against the system, the big bad system, free spirits against the institution. Left and right, doesn't matter. Universities are inherently bad machines. The plebes or the rabble against the state, insurrection against the state. No mediating term in between, no scission, pure terms in external inoperative opposition. Anti-institutionalism that leads nowhere. Emblematized in this famous picture that was stenciled during May 68 of Daniel Cohn-Bendit facing a riot officer who were typically described and attacked as CRS equals SS, right? Which then also appears on the cover of Lacan's L'envers de la psychanalyse, the other side of psychoanalysis. Now, Badiou does not want to be confused for a second with that approach. There's not just the law of capital or the cops. To miss this point is to stop seeing the unity of this place, its consistency. It is to fall back into objectivism, whose inverted ransom, by the way, is to make the state into the only subject, whence the anti-repressive logoria. And you could fill, you can replace the state with any institution you want today. This is the melodramatic, undialectical, inoperative, inexistent, or at least not truly operative contradiction in which we are trapped today. The idol for many of these eternal rebels is Nietzsche, who shortly before his collapse on January 3rd, 1889, in a draft to a letter of Georg Brandes, said, "We've just entered great politics, even into very great politics. I am preparing an event which in all likelihood will break history into two halves, to the point of that we will need a new calendar with 1888 as year one." This is Nietzsche, according to Badiou's reading in his seminar on Nietzsche, which I translated, which will come out next week, with the world broken into two. This is not the dialectical logic of scission. This is the inert external opposition between the free spirit or the active nihilist and the world that is entirely and intrinsically Christian or suffering from the Christian Platonic disease, from which you can only break away by exploding yourself. That's why Nietzsche says, I'm not a man, I'm dynamite. There will be before and after, but it will take 2,000 years and so many meters above sea level for people to understand that. To which, and of course, many people were turning away from Marx and Hegel toward Nietzsche in the same period. And this is also part of the polemic in which Badiou goes back to Hegel, and he answers them as follows. All those followers that sort of oppose the masses against the state, or the plebes, la plebe, against the big bad institutions, or the rioters against the administration, they dream of a formal antagonism of world broken in two with no sword other than ideology. They love revolt, proclaimed in its universality, but they are secondary in terms of politics, which is the real transformation of the world in its historical particularity. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you. Thanks, Bruno. So let me pose two questions maybe, and then we can open it up for discussion. First, on the introduction on Hegel in America, or Hegel and America. So one approach that you didn't mention, which seems a radically different approach, is to try to find ways in which one could maybe insert the Americas into a debate as having been in there silently, as having been part of the entire conversation. And so I'm thinking here of our last speaker, Susan Buck-Morss, and the way in which she does something which feels radically different, right? And of course, we can have debates about the historical connections, but she's relying on some archival evidence of the fact that, you know, Hegel was reading Minerva, writing letters to correspondents about what was going on in the pages of Minerva, and then what she does is she tries to derive from that this idea that actually Hegel was deeply engaged with the Haitian Revolution, thinking about the Haitian Revolution. Again, right, it requires some filling in of missing archives in the way in which a lot of historians are trying to do that today, under the name of critical fabulation sometimes, although I don't know if, I mean, of course, you know, there are issues with the concept of fabulation in the historical context both ways. I mean, in other words, all history is fabulation, but then, but here also we're not dealing with making up history because there are traces of Minerva in Hegel, say. So that seems like a different approach, which then I take it what Susan Buck-Morss was trying to do is to then find a way to rethink Hegel or make Hegel relevant to our thinking and our action today, right? And so where that goes with Susan Buck-Morss is towards an idea of trying to recuperate moments in history that are very different than the ones that we usually focus on, moments of resistance, moments of political resistance, but that you can find that there. And then you move away from Hegel in a certain way in terms of our usual old-fashioned readings of Hegel, but you keep something. But you also bring in that case, the Americas, I take it, since the Haitian Revolution was all about the Americas. So that seems like a very different approach, and and so you didn't address it in focusing instead on other thinkers and the absences of the Americas in Malabou, etc. I'm wondering about, here's one case where there's an interesting presence with it feels to me at least a productive cash out for what we could possibly do. I mean, a recuperation of a notion of universalism, whether you are in favor of that or not, hot debate, universal history, universal values. I can, we can have a whole 1313 on universality, etc. But it seems it seems at least possibly productive. So I wanted to get your take on that in terms of the introduction in Hegel in America. And then on Badiou and scission and this division. What I'm struggling with is the political implications and how it helps us. And of course, that's what I'm always looking for. It's an inversion of Hegel. But my question is, how does it politically help us? So I spent a lot of time struggling with it in Théorie de la Contradiction, and also in Theory of the Subject. In part because it's so clear that what Badiou has in mind, drawing on Mao, but what Badiou has in mind is thinking about theory and practice through this, through the lens of scission, right? One of the places where, so Théorie de la Contradiction, where it really starts is with probably maybe the most important claim here is that the unity of practice and theory is actually a division of practice and theory. It's a unity of two things that are in contradiction, but that they are located ultimately within theory, or that it's theory in a way, theory is the A equals the unity of theory and practice. And he actually suggests that on page 6 of Theory of the Subject, because he uses theory and practice as one of his examples. This is the proof, so this is on page 6. This is the proof that in order to think anything at all, something no matter what, it must be split in two. What is the meaning of the something in itself and the something for the other? Pure identity and placed identity, the letter and the space in which it is marked, theory and practice. And there's a sense in which that actually, that really reminds me of what he's doing in Théorie de la Contradiction, which is to try to show that, the central point here seems to be relying actually on Hegel and on Lenin. And so this is in Théorie de la Contradiction at page 17, that there's a condition, an internal contradiction in theory itself, which is the unity of, or the conflict between theory and practice, and that that's what's so important to him, is that actually the unity of theory and practice is within theory, is within connaissance. And he says, that reflects the most profound and the truest enunciation in Hegel, which is the absolute idea, is the identity of practical idea and theoretical idea. And this, of course, was something that Lenin was very enthusiastic about, unity of the theoretical idea and the practical idea. This unity is precisely in the theory of knowledge, right? So it's very important that there's this, so the Hegelian dialectic and the overcoming is eliminated, replaced by this scission, the noyau of the peach, which, as you know, when you hit the noyau and it splits in your mouth, there's a very aigre taste, right? Because all of a sudden you've entered into the heart of the noyau. What's noyau?
Kernel.
Kernel. And inside it, it's actually very amer, right? But so where does that? I mean, this has got to be the most important piece, I think, for Badiou, at least in 1975, right? As a militant Maoist trying to teach intellectuals something to catch up with the avant-garde working class Maoists. And yet I need some help, okay? Because I've got decision, I understand, I see how it's placed, I see that it becomes part of theoretical knowledge. I understand that practice and knowledge are then twined, that it goes practice, theory, practice. But I'm trying to figure out how that can both operate at the level of political practice, what it tells us, and particularly what it could possibly tell us today. Now, I have a sense that the political implications for you have very much something to do with resisting the brute opposition between, the revolutionaries and the establishment, right? The administration, the administration of the institution. And so I'm wondering if there's a way to actually make that a little bit more concrete in the relationship between theory and practice.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be brief about Susan's approach to Hegel and Hegel. It's very much along the lines of what I do, for example, in the book on the Mexican Commune, trying to read Marx from a different angle to bring him closer to a tradition that most Marxists or Marxologists don't talk about, similar to how she puts together archival pieces of a puzzle that portray a different Hegel. So I agree with that. I do think it's maybe symptomatic that she comes also out of a tradition of critical theory. And now today, I was focused on the new Hegel revival of people who openly and explicitly write from within a philosophical approach and who tend to choose that other more systematized path, that even though they insist on the need to bring in the historicity of thought, very often limit that to just stipulating that is something that needs to happen, but then don't actually practice it in what you receive. So this opposition between theory and philosophy, for me, I'm not sure if that whole the debates about the unity of theory and practice and so on, because is that it's a little bit like the Zusammenfallen, the falling together, or the coincidence of changing the circumstances and changing yourself. That's the utopian moment in Marx, right? That would be the moment where there is actual change going on. Now, we can describe what that moment would be, and there's something uplifting about that. And to the question, how does it help us? Well, I do think it helps us to realize that to perpetuate the inert opposition, which is actually not dialectical, between real extremes, this is Marx's term, like wirkliche Extreme, like to look at things that have no mediation between them, right? He gives this example when he's talking in his critique of Hegel about civil society and the state, and he says Hegel tries to sort of articulate the world of corporation, the state bureaucracy, and the state as an ethical idea. He actually never manages to provide us with a dialectical mediation. It always keeps falling apart. And he says actual extremes cannot be mediated with each other precisely because they are actual extremes. but neither are they in need of mediation, because they are opposed in essence. They have nothing in common with one another. They neither need nor complement one another. The one does not carry in its womb the yearning, the need, the anticipation of the other. This is, so the way I look at this is increasingly becoming a description of the state in which we find ourselves in. That kind of polarization in which there is no yearning to sort of cross over or to actually face the fact that we are also inscribed. If you go back to the picture of Cohn-Bendit, the idea would be, where's the cup that Cohn-Bendit carries inside him, and where's the free spirit that the cup might be carrying inside? And this is not just, can we all get along? This is about asking, what is the political structure of the opposition, where it is phrased in those anti-systemic terms of external opposition rather than dialectical exchange. The risk, however, is to set up the ideal of an articulation as a theoretical dream of what it would mean to put them together, or to have the unity of theory and practice. Well, as long as there is war and oppression and alienation and so on, there is not going to be the proper Zusammenfallen. They will not fall together, because there will be obstinate resistance from the facts on the ground. So it's a requirement to oscillate between acknowledging to what extent the falling apart of some of these dialectical oppositions is it actually a good description of what's going on right now under our current regime, and figuring out how to address that. And to me, it is a constant question: to what extent is this split of our own identities at work, that discomfort, that you can go back to all the guilty conscience and all the phenomenological figures from the Kozevi years about how that splits you apart, how it sunders you apart and produces unhappiness and discomfort and inability and powerlessness. But that's very different from the righteousness with which we can affirm our free-spirited distance from the big bad institution or the administrative state, which is now shared on both the left and the right in terms of anti-institutional thinking or libertarianism against institutions. And in that regard, there is something to be said for forms of embodied knowledge, including embodied in institutions, and that thinking happens in institutions, and that we are part of an institution at this very moment. And it is politically or rather, I would say, morally pleasing to situate oneself outside of that institution. But it is politically not very effective, because it doesn't change the institution. It does not operate by any return back on our own conditioning by those determinations. It just sets up a purified, cleansed, adventurous outside or outplace that feels no yearning. There's no need to nor complement of one another. They have nothing in common. One does not carry in its womb the yearning, the need, the anticipation of the other. Standoff, melodrama, conspiracy, inertia, brief flashes of splitting, but not actually the dialectical work of trying to see how things can change materially, institutionally. So that's, for me, it's a very, daily question.
Okay, so let's pick up on this question of scission. You want to get the mic, pass the mic down, Lena. Just pass the mic down a little bit. Yes. Make sure it's on. Just flip it towards you. Flip that thing towards you. Should I? It's on? Okay. Okay. Sounds like it's going. Is it going, Rita? Yeah? Okay.
So what I was curious about is what happened prior to May 16th to constitute the split that you talked about in Hegelian France. So it was mentioned that there was a sort of need that was felt to sort of start fresh, to get rid maybe of Marx and as the fighter of Hegel. But does this actually address the sort of historical conditions which sort of caused that split, or did it really just sort of maybe serve to ossify such a split, and thus set the conditions for today's non-operational opposition? So do we understand the split in the Hegelians of France from 68 as a precursor to today's situation, today's sort of oppositions and extremes, or is there something that Badiou added, or maybe delayed, that serves to constitute today's situation, and how do we make sense of that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think let's put it this way. In the 60s, like prior to 68, what was emerging simultaneously in the Marxist Althusserien camp and sort of the Derrida camp in the same building, the same institution, but with a different set of references, more based on Heidegger than on Marx and Hegel, was a critique of the dialectic as inherently metaphysical, thinking of identity, thinking of erasure or sublation and overcoming of differences. And so, in a sense, everything was internalized, the beginning was in the end, the process is teleological, there's no surprise. Hegel is unable to see coming a surprise or anything that would surprise him. But then gradually, as I mentioned, there's this footnote, and then in one of the interviews in Positions, Derrida sort of says, of course, you can also read Hegel differently, which will bring him very, very close to where I'm standing. So at the same time, in that school of thought, and I like to think just about schools of thought or patterns of thinking rather than proper names. And I was trying to see if we could do it today. It's nearly impossible, but I always tell also the students, I don't care about Badiou or, Bernard. It's about processes, right? And forms of thinking. But they were beginning to sort of revitalize. I mean, Bernard used the expression rethink or make Hegel relevant today. I think Malabou uses the literal expression of a facelift. Like you give Hegel a facelift. To making suddenly now a thinker of finitude, plasticity, difference, self-sundering, and Slavoj Žižek participates in this, Rebecca Comey. I mean, sort of the list goes on of thinkers who, against the commonsensical Hegelianism of sort of the pan-logic, all-absorbing machine that leaves no room for contingency, for struggle, for true struggle, now suddenly insist he's a finite thinker, he's thinking of plasticity, he's thinking of self-differentiation. Sublation can also be understood as a form of deconstruction. And then you get this, this goes on in Glas, it goes on in Jean-Luc Nancy's The Restlessness of the Negative, it goes on in this La Remarque Spéculative, which is the elaboration of that footnote in Derrida's paper, presented to Derrida's seminar to sort of explain, look, Hegel is the least teleological thinker you can think of. Everything is restless, everything is made to tremble, everything is shaken up, except, and this is where I think the thinkers that we're discussing today make a difference, they would draw a line before the subject of that torsion, of that working back on your own split identity. That requires a subject. This is why Badiou makes this bold provocation in the late 70s. It is now a requirement for a materialist theory, and remember, he is calling all his works theories. This is prior to the embrace of his own work as a systematic philosophy. It's theory of contradiction, of ideology, and theory of the subject. Now I lost my train of thought for a second there. So he says it is a requirement for the materialist today to provide a theory of the subject, which was the culmination of ideology for his own teacher, Althusser. How can you possibly say that you say Marxism today needs a theory of the subject? That's humanistic BS. We don't need a subject. That's the epitome of ideology, of legal, juridical, responsible, accountable subjects with the Nietzschean genealogy of human beings torturing themselves into the morality of resentment and subjection to the law, rather than being the doer, the free-spirited doer without a deed, or the deed rather than doing without either a deed or a doer. And Badiou says, no, we need a subject. Now that's a figure, subject, the operation of torsion, a subjective process. It requires activity, self-activity, Selbsttätigkeit, which also appears in the in that discussion in the mid 1840s when Engels and Marx are settling their accounts with Hegelianism. There's no room for that. So we are beginning to move with this new face of Hegel, who's as a finite, plastic, different, like last philosopher of the book, first philosopher of the text or of writing. Now we can basically re-evaluate or transvaluate everything in Hegel and sort of say, hey, he's almost the alter ego of Jacques Derrida. And that's to some extent what Jean-Luc Nancy did. But there's no room for subjectivization. There's no room for a subjective intervention. And this is the moment where Badiou says, if we understand that we need to think of the dialectic as a logic of splitting and scission, where everything is internally contradictory, and the actual work that needs to happen, which is turning back upon your own split identity constantly, that work requires a subject, a militant subject. And that is taboo for the Heideggerian line of thinking. And strangely, it was also taboo for the Althusserian line of thinking. So at that point, those two camps join forces and find themselves again in this sort of celebration later on of aleatory materialism and so on, which is still, a process without a subject and so on and so forth. So I wouldn't say that Badiou's treatment of this is a precursor to the inoperative external opposition that we find today. But the very fact that even the term mediation, even, aside from the fact that if you talk to our colleagues in the Center for Comparative Media, they are all for mediation. But if you're talking to a Hegelian or a post-Hegelian, then we know that mediation is kind of synonymous with everything that's wrong with Hegel's dialectic, right? Well, that's when they fall apart into this inoperativity. In fact, inoperativity becomes one of the leitmotifs of that other orientation of thinking, which is against militancy, but still in the name of the radical externality against whichever name you want to give the entity of Western metaphysics or the state.
Great. Daniela Gondorfer.
And I was especially interested in your whole framing, so you basically gave two And the first part, the method and why Hegel and why now and the Americas and the situatedness in Europe and so on and so forth. I think this is very interesting. And I want to, because it's a kind of an alchemical mixture of a question, because I can think it through fully, I start with the end, and the end would be, do we need language as the main form of, or main power of sense making, and is this something that we in institutions, especially knowledge institutions, are holding on to now? Now let me quickly go back why. I think a couple of times you pointed us to the connection of territory, almost Schmidt, land, and I think there's also something missing, which is language, and I think this was that, because I think that the colonizer brings is language. And all the philosophers, so Hegel, Marx, but most of the ones you cited before, they all lived, most of them lived after the Estonian world order was established. So you had institutions, not like now, you had a centralized state, you had language. When Hegel wrote, the German philosophy was big, and the whole idea was that you can think philosophy to a German and to use the German language to a degree that is simply more sophisticated than anything else. So I think there's a point about the connection between land and language at that time. Schmidt also, when he talked about Lenin, when he talked about land, he got very nervous that the airspace, the sea space opened up because he couldn't draw lines in the sea into the air. And then obviously it's bad for the jurisdiction of the German right. So I think there's a lot that goes together here, and the reason why I'm bringing this up is when we talk about the unity of theory and practice, I think there's still, especially when we talk about literature or philosophy at the university, the idea that we need to analyze with and through language, and what we need to produce through or resistance or our praxis is concepts that are representational and other concepts. And when you say that thinking is, we think in an institution that's important, then what I wonder is whether this really is the case, or whether we have to see how we can think and the dynamisms that we see in Hegel or Marx, how we can translate them into praxis outside of the institutions. And I'm almost done. The reason why I'm asking this is I work on the privatization of governance and law with technology, and I went to a conference in Dubai where a billionaire talked about the future of America, which is not the US, but it's the network state of the internet. So you saw an American flag, and instead of the stars, we had all startup signs in the text space. And their territory and land was explicitly not, it doesn't matter anymore. And also, language doesn't matter, theory doesn't matter anymore. It makes sense with AI, and that's not representation of market. We don't need institutions without financial technologies. So to bring it back, the question for me is, can we use data to think outside of the institutions and not in language or forms, but in ways of doing and creating concepts in this world that might create alternatives to what these people are doing? If it makes any sense.
Thank you, Daniela.
Well, it would be a performative contradiction and an irony to say, yes, let's think, being in an institution, let's think about forms of thinking that are situated outside language and an institution. I can see many of your points. I would just like to say that while we may increasingly become obsolescent, right now the thinking and the knowledge or the theorization and so on, which is not just philosophical, as I think I explained, but can cover many registers and practices and institutions. But I still think it cannot happen outside institutions of some kind. And I think this is also where Hegel's philosophy of right can help us. A friend of mine who will recognize himself in this statement said, I think you're arguing for no thinking outside the institution, which is pretty much going against the grain of common sense today. But when we're in the midst of conscious efforts to dismantle all forms of institutions other than the markets, I do believe there is worth in thinking, what am I doing to create an institution in which certain forms of thinking, including the study of language, which is after all what I do, and translation, study of language, study of thought, ideas, takes place. It can be in music, it can be in nonverbal or non-linguistic, cartographic, diagrammatic, musical expressions. To me, it's still, those are forms of the real that are embodied and embedded in some institutional framework or frameworks in the plural, without which it's an illusion, I think, to believe that one can do anything. I don't know where that space is. The famous inside-outside the teaching machine, especially when one says that within a university.
All right. So we're out of time, but we're going to take 3 more questions anyway, because whatever. And you're all invited afterwards. We're going to go to the pub, so we'll continue the conversation. But I saw, and I'm sorry, we're just going to take the ones that I saw first, which was Lena, Aaron, and Hassan, and I think that maybe we should take all 3 because. Yeah, because we're over time already. So let's take all 3, then we'll allow you to give some concluding thoughts, and then we'll all go continue the discussion at the pub. You know what? I'll just pass you mine. It's not. No. We want to record it. So here, just try this one.
Okay, thank you so much for giving up your microphone. I'll be quick then, since we don't have much time. I was just wondering, so thank you so much for the talk. This was very rich. And I wanted to go back to the very first quote that you gave us, the Zambrano one, where you were like, to be is to be intelligible. And I just wanted you to expand on that, what exactly that means, because it seemed to me that you were kind of hanging on to this and then also attributing it to different readings or different thinkers that you mentioned. But I felt it was in tension with, first of all, like the kernel of materiality, and then also what Dussel brought up, which I thought was like one of the main points would be something like, well, actually this is a Western misunderstanding, and this covers over the like ways of beings that are different or outside of this way of thinking. So yeah, I just wanted to ask what exactly you mean with this. Thank you.
Thanks, Lena, and thanks, Professor Bosteels. I wanted to come back to the question that was kind of posed by Kay about 1968, and specifically the question of the subject, or really of spontaneity, which I think is what was being brought up, right? Is there room for spontaneity? And this reminded me of both the message from the Sorbonne, the Combendit brothers, but also Rudi Dutschke, the idea that there was a sort of necessary, spontaneous corrective to the organizational forms inherited from the past, and especially the party, right, which seemed to be in some way integrated into capital. And obviously a lot of the interest in the Cultural Revolution is the call to bomb the party headquarters, right? That the Cultural Revolution is the people going and bombing party headquarters, but then in 1977, after 76 and the fall of the Gang of Four, right, retrospectively, it can look like bombing the party headquarters actually just paved the way for the renewal of capitalism, not just in China, but all around the world, right, under Deng Xiaoping and others. And it seems as though the question of like the subject is being posed in this context. And so I was wondering if you could speak maybe to like, was there some sort of potential to overcome like the seeming opposition between organization and spontaneity? In one of the sections from the theory of the subject that was assigned, right, he discusses Marxism-Leninism as Christianism-Paulism, which I assume is some sort of reference to Gramsci. And he says that victorious Leninism articulates a new subject. I wonder like how much that can be taken for granted or what it means. Like, is there a subject? Is the theory of the subject a demand to theorize an existing subject, or is it a demand to constitute a subject? I wasn't going to say something about this, but actually I think I should. The quote from the Grundrisse about capital, right? And that how when capital becomes capital, it has to create once again for itself its own conditions of possibility, which then appeared to be the result of capital as opposed to actually precursors, which did not necessarily have to result in capital. And he has in mind there, for instance, the market, right? Free labor, bourgeois social relations. And I wonder too about this identification of capital with the market, as in, aren't we falling prey to, right, the way in which capital appears to create its own conditions and in fact has to, and thus naturalizes those conditions. And isn't part of the point also, I mean, definitely for Badiou and for these thinkers of 68, that this seems to be happening to revolutionary practice, right? That the revolutionary tradition, which is supposed to oppose capital, instead of being, the coming together of human action and change, which transforms the world, is actually the adaptation of human action to change which is already happening. And so the revolutionary tradition appears to simply recreate the conditions of possibility for capital and to itself become, right, posited as the result of capital, and that this happened to the Marxist 20th century, but then also in a different way to the spontaneous new movements of the 60s, right? The new social movements, but also, the turn to the people in the Cultural Revolution. Okay, I hope that wasn't too much, sorry.
Hello? Okay. Well, I'd like to apologize in advance because in a way I am also going to vulgarize these statements. But I found this seminar quite fitting, especially that photo. And to use your Bosteels words against them in a sense, I think this seminar, Bosteels seminar, split the 13 series into, I think it was an absolute masterclass. That said, I'd just like to recuperate the caricature of Nietzsche as this sort of simplistic thinker who is anti-institutional and for the plebs and everybody else is Platonic and metaphysical and so on. I think Nietzsche, is it truly the case that Nietzsche is this such a simplified thinker where in fact there are moments of Nietzsche where he even proclaims himself as offensively Hegelian? Nietzsche himself, I think, exemplifies this notion of the scission. To quote Deleuze, he takes he goes in these great heights of health and perceives it from sickness and then vice versa and so on. So it seems to me that Nietzsche is not this sort of caricature in the free spirit, but in fact exemplifies this notion of decision. And secondly, in regards to the institution and so on, I found that fitting, that photo specifically quite fitting because on my way to the seminar, I was stopped by the police, and I was actually thinking of not coming. But in a way, I think it was beneficial because in my enunciation of this event, I then introduced a new modality or a new discourse within these settings because I doubt people within this institutional setting have experienced the embodied effect of imprisonment, arrest, exile, and so on. So I doubt, but so when you say politically ineffective in regards to anti-institutional thinking, politically ineffective to whom? Is this a Hegelian move of a professor defending his position within the institution? Or is this a radical stance critiquing the institution from within, despite maintaining what Gramsci would call a warped position? So these are my 2 points.
Thank you,
I
Hassan.
apologize for the vulgar.
Thank you, as always. Bruno, you have the last word.
So thank you for those questions. I'll try to be quick, but yeah, to be is to be intelligible. This is a little bit, again, to go against the grain of a common axiom that is tacitly or openly accepted today, which says that there is a gap between being and thinking, or between to be and to be intelligible, and that history cannot be narrativized into logic. That's a quote, you know. When a previous participant in the seminar, not during a seminar, but in a text, says the subaltern is the absolute limit where history refuses to be narrativized into logic. That's the notion that there are uprisings, rebellions, subaltern movements that do not fit and that escape the presumably Hegelian narrativization of history into logic, that pull back against that teleology. But even when, as soon as we want to talk about those moments of resistance or rebellion, we are understanding them as intelligible from within their own existence. And so it's not a contradiction of, or it's not a refutation of the notion that the historical and the logical coincide, to quote from Zhang Xi. So that's why I like this phrase very much, and I did attribute it to many people. I don't think it contradicts the kernel of materiality or even Dussel's argument. Dussel is just trying to say what is being thought under these concepts, for example, modernity, is broader and wider and is internally split than what European philosophy has made it out to be for the most part. Right? About spontaneity and the subject, that was not the only question. I very much like your question about, is the theory of the subject the theory of an existing subject or the theory that asks for the constitution of one? It's obviously the latter, but since all concepts and theories are the result and fed by and sort of retrofeed into practices, it also tries to think subjective processes that are already ongoing, right? So it's kind of a mix. At one point, or in several occasions in these early books from the Red Years, Badiou says that all Marxist texts should be called The Situation and Our Tasks, right? It's always descriptive and prescriptive. It's always talk about the circumstances, where are things at, and what are the tasks? How are you? What's the call for intervention in that context? And I think this is for those who still hold on to a notion of the subject, and that's strangely something that all the Althuserians share today. For Althusser, the subject was nothing but an ideological category, but for Balibar, for Rancière, for Badiou, there is no truth without a subject, without a form of subjectivization, even if it is kind of a disidentification. Precisely because you have to disidentify with the split identity. And my dear Hassan, I will skip the Plato part because in the introduction to the translation of the Nietzsche seminar, I sort of go through the different ways in which Badiou has ignored or responded or invoked Nietzsche in his writings. And he does invoke this notion of Nietzsche as the very embodiment of the splitting in two of his own personality, which Badiou says is a non-clinical way of describing his madness. He kind of has to be the announcement of the overman and the overman himself. That's why he needs to explode. He himself needs to, break down. But then interestingly, Badiou ties this notion of the splitting in two of the history of the world with the extremes of the Cultural Revolution, and he uses the figure of the splitting of the world split in two halves as a denunciation that I think can also be read as a self-criticism. And about your last question, I hope that, it is always a valid and easy rebuttal against any professor or any professor who's also an administrator. Is this sort of a justification of the status quo? Your own function within the institution? Sure. The problem is, like, when does either that criticism or the self-flagellation of somebody who would accept that accusation turn into sort of moral good conscience? And I don't have moral good conscience. So I'm not saying that as praise for myself in disguise. It's just that I take that very question as a leitmotif for how to approach your own existence within an institution like a university on a daily basis. So I have no answer to that, and it's in a sense it's a provocation that pushes sort of the work both within the institution or in the classroom further along. So either I can say guilty as charged, and I will certainly not make a claim that I'm like radically changing the institution from within. There are minimal shifts. There's like moments of horizontalization in a classroom. There's the ability or the possibility of flipping a syllabus, or of taking out the proper names of the big figures on 1313 and talking about actual processes. Like, I agree, Hegel and Hegel, but we don't do a 1313 on the Haitian Revolution. I know there was one on uprisings. But, we're all on the slippery slope where it's kind of easier to imagine if we have a home, we have a figure to refer to with a proper name, with an established, I don't know how many volumes of the complete works, still being edited and translated. There's something comforting about that. And what I liked about my readings of Badiou, which also happened sort of on a whim, based on accident, and even though he has been read constantly and uninterruptedly in Latin America, long before his discovery or cover-up in English. But what I like about a book like Theory of the Subject, for example, it is absolute chaos. This work on language, and as a translator, to sort of be immersed in that movement of all these building blocks that really don't fit together. It's not a philosophical system. You go from Mallarmé's poems to Hölderlin's theory of tragedy, from Marx and Mao to Hegel, to Lacan, to the theory of emotions like courage and justice and terror and superego injunction, all supposedly to answer the crisis that the left experiences in post-1968 France. It's sort of like, do with it what you want, right? And that's probably true too for many of Hegel's books, which are also based on seminar, especially the lecture on the philosophy of world history, and notes from people in the audience. So it's kind of a toolbox, and that's all that I wanted to bring out. That I am struggling with that ourselves. We are seeing how institutions of higher education are consciously and strategically being dismantled, not only from outside, but also from within. And what to do about that? This is local. for me. This is like, well, this is where it's at for me. And there's other circles that overlap or not with the level of, or the circle of the institution or the university. So I don't have an answer to that, and I don't want to have an answer to that. It's more, you know, I'll go back to the first quote. If you don't study the negative stuff, you won't be able to refute it. Right? So yeah, you have to study the negative stuff, including the negative stuff that we carry with us on a daily basis and that we pretend to be not there. So I'll leave it there.
All right, and yeah, I mean, I suppose the only thing I would add is I don't know if it fits under
your microphone.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. I don't know if it's moral good consciousness that works best, or if it's a question of dirty hands, maybe.
Yeah, of course. But, and that's sort of the Sartrean figure of dirty hands. Like, well, I shouldn't say that, but Hegel has this figure of the beautiful soul, and universities overproduce beautiful souls. That's what I would say.
All right. Great. Well, thank you very much. So please join us. Please join us at the pub for a end of semester gathering. There will be one